Hi, Founder fans, Jason here, and today's founder is John Lansing. Now, John Lansing was a young man from New York when the Revolutionary War broke out. He had studied law under Robert Yates, which becomes important later, and he goes on to start a pretty successful law firm. Except almost immediately, he starts this law firm, and as I said, the Revolutionary War breaks out, and he starts a firm and almost immediately leaves to join the Continental Army. And he serves as an aide-de-camp for General Philip Schuyler. He is working directly with Philip Schuyler, and Schuyler was the number 3 highest ranking general in the Continental Army, or no, maybe 4. They changed positions a lot, but it was George Washington, Artemus Ward, Charles Lee, and then Philip Schuyler. Because New York was so important, they needed one of the highest ranking major generals in the army to be from New York. And even though he wasn't really an army man or soldier, lifetime soldier, Schuyler always participated in the militia and things of that nature, and he was one of the most important who negotiated with Native American tribes, and that was a very key position in New York. And Lansing finds himself right in this circle, controlling the Northern Army and negotiating with Native Americans and almost participating in the invasion of Canada, except he's only there for a few months when he receives election to the New York State Assembly, the provincial assembly as it was called at the time. And he was just 26 years old, and this starts a lifetime of really important politics. Now, Lansing spends most of the war in state politics, overseeing New York State and its transition from colony to state, and he even becomes Speaker of the House for 2 years. And furthermore, he gets elected mayor of Albany. So Albany at this point, I know nowadays Albany, New York is not the biggest city in the world. It's kind of known as a corrupt capital. At the time, Albany was one of the bigger cities in the young United States. And it was not yet capital of New York, but it was extraordinarily important. And as mayor of Albany, this is a great position. Now, he does take a year. He goes to the Confederation Congress, as the Continental Congress was called, when people, after the Articles of Confederation were signed. And in the Continental Congress, he becomes friendly with a few young men, Alexander Hamilton and James Madison. And they're all complaining about how terrible the Articles of Confederation are. But Lansing goes home, he becomes mayor again, works in the state assembly again for a few years, and then there's a convention called in Philadelphia. Now, we know this convention today as the Constitutional Convention. They knew it as the Philadelphia Convention, and Lansing is one of 3 men from New York sent to this Constitutional Convention. He's sent with Robert Yates, who I said before was his mentor and taught him law in the first place, and one of the towering figures in New York politics, and a young Alexander Hamilton. And these 3 men go down, and almost right away, Virginia presents the idea that, oh, we're going to write a whole new federal government here. And Lansing said, no, we were only supposed to be here to amend the Articles of Confederation. And that's what the New York instructions said. And we need to keep in mind that the delegates to the Continental Congress and the Constitutional Convention, they were very attached to their instructions. They were not representing themselves, and they weren't even representing the people. They were representing their states. Their state sent them to represent the state government and gave them very specific instructions as to what the state wanted. What the state said is you could amend the Articles of Confederation, but the state said nothing, the instructions said nothing about writing a new government. And after only about 6 weeks, both John Lansing and Robert Yates end up leaving the Constitutional Convention because this is too much. It is not what we were sent here to do. If we improve it, if these men were to ratify the Constitution, they thought they could be arrested for breaking the rules, for essentially committing treason for the independent nation that was New York. Because, yes, under the Articles of Confederation, each state was a separate nation. They were different countries. They just had a firm league of friendship. And now they were turning all these separate countries into one country, and that is not what their instructions said. So Lansing does decide to leave the Constitutional Convention. A side note, that's why when you see the signers of the Constitution, it says, and Mr. Hamilton of New York, because the rest of New York's delegates left and said, New York said we can't do this. And it's kind of like a cover your but situation by Mr. Hamilton to say, and Mr. Hamilton of New York. Either way, Lansing goes back, becomes a pretty important anti-federalist, and is really one of the people who helps make the vote in New York extraordinarily close. In fact, one of the reasons the Federalist Papers are written in New York is because John Lansing and his friend Robert Yates and their other friend Melancton Smith and their other friend Governor George Clinton are all very actively opposing the Constitution. And in an effort to counter that and get the Constitution ratified by New York, that's why Madison and Hamilton go back to New York and write the Federalist Papers there. Although I will say, the Continental Congress was meeting there, and that's why Madison was also there, and Hamilton was from there. So, to be fair, don't call me out on that. Either way, John Lansing, despite opposing the federal government, is still really respected. I should note that the New York's Ratification Convention only ratifies the Constitution 30 to 27. 30 to 27. That is 3 votes, which means if 2 people change their mind, New York does not ratify the Constitution. Now, Lansing does leave the state assembly for a while. He continues as mayor of Albany for a little bit. But in 1790, just after this, you'd think it might have hurt his career, but no, just after this, he's actually chosen to sit on the New York Supreme Court as an associate justice. After 8 years, he's actually promoted to Chief Justice of the New York State Supreme Court. After that, he actually is given the position of Chancellor. Now, we don't have the position of Chancellor anymore. I don't want to get too into the weeds of it, but technically, Chancellor was a higher judicial position than Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, because the Supreme Court had many people and Chancellor was just you. But the difference is what the types of cases they decided. Now, so Lansing ends up taking over for Robert Livingston, who had been Chancellor since the beginning of the Revolution. Livingston goes to France to buy Louisiana, and John Lansing becomes, again, the highest justice in New York. Now, he holds this for about a decade and a half, and then retires at 60 years old. When he's 60 years old, he's in a hotel in New York City doing some work. He leaves the hotel to go mail a letter, and then he vanishes. Poof. Gone. I should update. He retired at 60. He was about 75 when he goes to mail the letter. Poof. Gone. It is one of the great mysterious disappearances in the history of New York City. He is one of the most famous lawmen, and by lawmen I mean justices, lawmakers, judges in the history of New York State, and he just disappears. Now, we don't know what happened. It has never been solved. There are some ideas. The most likely candidate for where he went, from what I understand, is that he probably fell off a dock and drowned. They were old-timey docks. You could trip on him. He was an older man at this point. He probably fell off a dock and drowned. I do want to note, there was a publication in 1882, because he dies. He lives a long time. He was young during the Revolution, so his death is in the 1830s, or his disappearance is in the 1830s. Okay, so like Andrew Jackson's president by the time he dies. 50 years after that, there was a publication that claims he was murdered by several businessmen who wanted him out of the way. But he was kind of looks out for the people. As far as the wealthy elite in New York City went in the early 1800s, he looked out for the people at large, and there were several businessmen who he did not help. We'll put it like that. And there is this accusation that these businessmen wanted him out of the way and may have murdered him. To be fair, this seems very unlikely because he was retired. He held no real power other than the respect of people at the time. So this seems unlikely. Unfortunately, we will never know the fate of John Lansing, a Chief Justice and Chancellor of New York State, who walked out of the Constitutional Convention because he did not like what they were saying. I hope you learned something about John Lansing today. If you did, definitely hit like. If you're new here, subscribe. I put out videos about the American Revolution all week long. So hit like and subscribe. And Fridays we play trivia, so come for that.